Some interesting, some good information. Our next speaker is Dr. Brian Whisenant. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Dr. Whisenant is Medical Director of Intermountain Medical Center's Structural Heart Disease Program in Murray, Utah, and focuses on structural heart disease, percutaneous aortic valve replacement, etc. Please.
Said very well. Thanks for having me. Today I will suggest that warfarin does not adequately address the risk of stroke and atrial fibrillation, that novel oral anticoagulants provide a modest incremental advantage over warfarin but fail to bridge the warfarin treatment deficit, that atrial fibrillation is a chronic condition and that chronic anticoagulation is inherently undesirable. The PROTECT-AF trial demonstrated an equivalent stroke reduction with the Watchman device compared to warfarin, and demonstrated the potential of left atrial appendage closure to actually exceed oral anticoagulation in terms of stroke reduction. Finally, AFib-mediated stroke is a mechanical and thrombotic problem that demands both a mechanical as well as a pharmaceutical solution. We know from numerous publications that only 50 to 60% of high-risk patients with atrial fibrillation are treated with oral anticoagulants. If we look at this study, by 6 years after initiating warfarin, only about 30% of patients remain on warfarin, independent of their CHADS score. In this widely cited meta-analysis of 19 clinical trials, warfarin prevented 28 ischemic strokes at the expense of 11 major or fatal bleeding episodes. And this is in the best patients who are appropriate for randomization. We usually don't know how many patients are screened, but this publication actually demonstrated that only 7% of those screened were appropriate for randomization, suggesting that in the true population, the risk is much higher than what we see in the randomized data set. This is a little bit difficult to see, but it looks at the rate of anticoagulant-associated intracerebral hemorrhage in a population. And it shows that since 1988, with the advent of warfarin for the treatment of atrial fibrillation, the risk of anticoagulant-associated intracerebral hemorrhage has increased from 0.8 events per 100,000 patient years to 4.4. Now that sounds small, but if you look at the patients over age 80, the rate has increased from 2.5 to 46, while the rate of AFib-mediated stroke has only decreased from 22 to 20.6 in 1993 versus 1999. The AFFIRM study is perhaps the best trial we have looking at a stroke population that was not specifically designed to look at anticoagulation. And here we see that the yearly incidence of stroke was 2.3%, which is probably what is observed in most of our patients, major bleeding 1.8%. Now, of course, patients were followed for 3.5 years in the AFFIRM trial. The stroke rate in the AFFIRM trial was actually 8.2%. What a staggering number. 8.2% of all patients in this trial had a stroke. Major bleeding, 6.4%, minor bleeding, 18.2%, in only 3.5 years. Warfarin clearly does not adequately address the AFib population's risk of stroke. Do new anticoagulants address this tremendous unmet clinical need? There have been several publications demonstrating that dabigatran has not extended the number of patients being treated with oral anticoagulants. Rather, they have captured about 20-25% of the Coumadin market. We have seen this data demonstrating a reduction in stroke with dabigatran compared to warfarin. We know that the discontinuation rate with dabigatran was actually higher than with warfarin. In the 150 milligram dose, it was 21% at 2 years in the trial compared to 16% with warfarin. This is obviously too small to read, unfortunately. I need to fix that. But the rate of major bleeding was 3.1% per year with dabigatran. The minor bleeding was 16% with dabigatran. This is per year. The rate of major bleeding in the population over age 75 was 5.1% per year with dabigatran, emphasizing that these are the patients who we most commonly see, and many people feel that patients over age 75 are simply not candidates for the novel anticoagulants or the newer anticoagulants based on this increased bleeding risk. This is a case report of a patient who presented to the emergency room with headache after mild traumatic brain injury while taking dabigatran. And here you see what his CAT scan looked like at presentation. 2.5 hours later, it looked like this. 6 hours later, it looked like this. there is no antidote for this medication. If one does a PubMed search on dabigatran and hemorrhage, you'll come up with 270 different reports. I clearly do not have time to review those today. If one does a Google search on dabigatran and lawsuit, you come up with about 775,000 results in 0.3 seconds. There must be some people who are having problems with this. Rivaroxaban, a little bit better than warfarin, but those lines look pretty parallel to me. And again, principal safety endpoint, major and non-major clinically relevant bleeding, 14.9% per year. Major bleeding, 3.6% per year in the ROCKET-AF trial. And then here with apixaban, lines a little bit better with apixaban than warfarin, but still pretty parallel. And here you have major clinically relevant bleeding, 4% per year with apixaban. This is the data from the PROTECT-AF trial, published just a few weeks ago in Circulation. This is almost 1,600 patient years. The primary efficacy endpoint, which was the composite of ischemic stroke, cardiovascular death, hemorrhagic stroke, and systemic embolism, 3 events per 100 patient years with device versus 4.3 with drug. All stroke, 2 per 100 patient years with device versus 2.7 with stroke. We all know the story with the PROTECT-AF data set, how it went to the FDA, went to panel, the panel voted for approval, company was gearing up for commercialization, and then this editorial came out by Dr. Mizell, who worked for the FDA in the New England Journal prior to the final FDA approval. And to quote him, he said, after 900 patient years of observation, the rate of the primary endpoint was 32% lower in the Watchman group than in the conventional therapy group, a result that met the pre-specified criterion for non-inferiority. However, we should heed the lessons learned from the well-publicized recent problems with other cardiovascular devices, including drug-eluting stents and implantable defibrillator leads. In those cases, large number of patients were rapidly exposed to new devices on which there were limited performance data. And so here we have the FDA moving the goalposts, and this is clearly a therapy that suffered from the politics of the time, and that is why, in my mind, it was not FDA approved. Now, I seem to be stuck here. Can you help me advance that? Dr. Mizell went on and explained some of his criticisms of the PROTECT-AF trial and why he did not believe that it should lead to FDA approval. That included a large number, about 27% of patients with a CHADS score of 1, a lower risk population. They were critical of the patients who received combined therapy with Plavix as well as warfarin for a period of time. They talked about the procedural complications. Suboptimal warfarin management in the control group. And can we go to the next slide? This is a common issue that we have with all new technologies coming. We can go back one slide, please. With all these new technologies coming into the marketplace, into clinical trials with their first exposure, and that is that early experience adverse events are increased compared to later. And the slide that we just missed showed a reduction in major adverse events in the PROTECT-AF trial from 7 point something percent down to 3.5%, I believe, in the CAP registry, showing a clear learning curve with this. Here we go, 7.7% to 3.7% in the CAP registry. I'm not sure what's happening here. Warfarin compliance and control group showed a time and therapeutic range in the PROTECT-AF trial of 67%, which was clearly better than Aristotle, ROCKET-AF, and RELY, as well as the precedent anticoagulant trials. It was actually remarkably good, despite their criticism. And next slide. The CHADS score in the PROTECT-AF control group was 2.3 versus RELY and Aristotle 2.1. This looks at patients with prior stroke from secondary prevention. And here you see in these nearly 150 patients, the relative risk of the primary endpoint in patients with a prior stroke was actually 0.64 with device compared to drug. It is highly efficacious even in these high-risk patients. This looks at terminal therapy. So terminal therapy is an analysis of what happened to patients after the warfarin and Plavix were discontinued in the device arm. The event rate was 1.3 events per 100 patient years with device versus 3.6 with control, with a hazard ratio of 0.35. This is perhaps the best proof of concept that we have with left atrial appendage closure. Incredibly powerful data. Now, this publication out of Protect AF from a few weeks ago looked at 1,000 patients with device and about 500 patients with control. In fact, in my office, I see patients who have now had their Watchman device placed over 5 years ago and are doing incredibly well. We have about over 400 patients, just under 400 patients, 440 patients randomized to device in the Protect AF trial who have all been followed for 5 years now. That's over 2,500 patient year exposure to device in the Protect AF trial. I showed you some safety data out of the CAP registry. We have not seen efficacy data. That data will be available very soon. This is 400 patient years also followed for 400 patients also followed for over 400 patients also followed for over 5 years, another 2,000 patient years. We will see the PREVAIL data set coming out at ACC a week from tomorrow. So instead of the 1,000 patient years of device exposure that we have seen published so far, in the next months we will see 5,000 patient years of device exposure, and assuming this is moving in the direction that is consistent with Protect AF, this will become a very powerful data set demonstrating the efficacy of this therapy. I'm frozen again. So the criticism that Protect AF was a small trial. When the magnitude of effect is big, the number does not. When the magnitude of effect is big, the number is small. When the magnitude is small, the number is big. So we had large trials with the novel anticoagulants. And advance. Here we go. 20 years ago, I was a resident, and we talked for hours and hours about the Gusto trial. 41,000 patients randomized between therapies with streptokinase versus TPA for the prevention of acute myocardial infarction. The in-hospital mortality decreased from 7.2% with streptokinase therapies to 6.3%. It took 41,000 patients to demonstrate that. Now, we talked for hours and hours, but that conversation died down very quickly. And can you advance next slide? When the PAMI trial was published. 395 patients randomized to either primary angioplasty with an in-hospital mortality of 2.6% or TPA with an in-hospital mortality of 6.3%. And the risk of hemorrhagic stroke disappeared from 2% with TPA to 0 with the primary angioplasty trial. So that suggests, is atrial fibrillation comparable to STEMI? And that this is a thrombotic problem with a mechanical solution, and we need to eliminate the left atrial appendage. So in conclusion, we need to move beyond this inane debate and figure out how to combine LAA closure with some medical therapy and start taking care of patients. It's not a question of if, but rather how. Finally, Matt, I thought you were an honest interventional cardiologist. How did you end up on the wrong side of this argument? So chances of anything going wrong are 1 in 20,000? I'd say 1 in 50,000. Deal? Matt, it's all yours. Thank you very much.